things like snow conditions, exposure, things like that, but he knows what he's doing and he's dressed appropriately other than the outdated ski poles. Here's an example of risk. One underlying thing when we talk about risk in this course is this is a way to think about all the ways adults have screwed up and learned from our mistakes. So we'll be blaming all adults, not just me as an adult, but adults before us. Here's an example of that. These are all people that had radium exposure at factories where they were painting radium on watch faces. The woman on the right actually had demineralization of her jawbone, causing that drooping. They used tiny bristles and they would lick the bristles between each number to keep them pointed straight. Initially, it had a cool impact because they were known around town because whenever they smiled at establishments at night, their teeth were glowing. Initially, people, before you saw things like tissue death called necrosis and bone demineralization, people actually started liking it. They decided radium was great. They made radium skin cream, which is what you see right here. Radium suppositories that go to places that are unspeakable. Radium butter. Yes, radium jock straps. Radium watch faces. Perhaps the watch faces were the least dangerous thing other than the workers. We weren't just stupid with applying it. We gave radiation to kids as toys. And when they recall radioactive play with atomic energy toy kits, they don't actually recall them. No one was contacted. You could probably, if you hunted around, find these things in antique stores today. Here are other examples of risk. Well, just think of some. We'll just pretend this is interactive. Risk is defined as two things: exposure and harm. Exposure is how long you're exposed to the risk. Harm is what's the potential danger of this risk. Here I am on a rafting trip with some friends, and yes, there's exposure and harm danger. The length was not too long. We're only in the river for a little bit. What we did to reduce the potential danger were things like wearing protective gear, and my friend Tony and his wife, who were our amazing guides for the trip. They won't ever, on the AP exam, make you calculate risk, even though some textbooks show it as exposure times harm. Risk management is one of the underlying things of this course. Here's someone digging an avalanche pit to reduce risk danger. When we talk about risk management, there's the questions. Imagine a nagging adult saying, is it serious? Can you reduce the risk? How much should you reduce the risk? How could you? And how much are you willing to spend to make things safer? One example of this is the best thing to do for avalanche safety, besides avoiding avalanche-prone areas, is whenever you're in the backcountry, you should be digging one of these pits, and it takes hours. And avalanche training goes over all of this because I'm not trained in avalanche instruction. I can't tell you too much of the details, but it's ways to recognize slabs that are loose and going to slide. The dilemma is it takes hours to do. The other thing with avalanche safety is there's lots of things you can do to increase your safety. One of the best things are the James Bond style avalanche inflatable suits that will actually inflate as you trigger an avalanche. One thing with that is it does cause people to go farther in the backcountry, and when they trigger an avalanche, it could hit someone else. And that's another thing to understand with risk management is this concept called threshold of acceptable risk. How much are you willing to encounter danger? And this is actually quite various. Sorry for the typo. It varies by the person. One weird thing is the more risk you expose yourself, the more comfortable you are to being in that risk, and you actually start pushing the risk farther. The other thing is how much safety are you willing to incorporate? Examples of this are when we put in anti-lock brakes, it made cars safer, but it caused people to drive more recklessly, so we've actually have about the same rate of car accidents. Same could be said about seatbelts. No, that being said, seatbelts are very important. So are airbags, so are anti-lock brakes. Other examples of this is since we started requiring helmets on ski slopes, you have a lot of skiers and snowboarders doing inverted aerials. In the 80s and 90s, when I did more downhill, to end up upside down in the air was a colossal mistake. Now people do it thinking the helmets will keep them safe. Don't mind my dog there. To go with this, so that is Spike, who is pushing his own risk right now by barking while I'm recording videos. Here's an example of threshold of acceptable risk.
Spring break for a while, about 2 months without the strip playing. 2-3 months. We're just out here having a good time. Whatever happens, happens. Like, it's really messing up with my spring break. What is there to do here other than go to the bars or the beach and they're closing all of it? It's really messing up. I think they're blowing it way out of proportion. I think it's doing way too much. Doing us bad. We need a refund. This virus ain't that serious. It's serious. It's more serious things out there like hunger and poverty. We need to address that. Yeah, I think we played this a long time ago, and it was kind of up in the air if we still go, but like we're here. I just turned 21 this year,
so. Right there you saw examples of people with thresholds of risk. One danger with infectious disease is the risk doesn't stop with you. You're extending it to other people as well. So there's some really good books written about threshold of acceptable risk. One of the main ones is called Deep Survival by an author named Lawrence Gonzalez. So going with risk, the part of your brain that is stimulated by risk is, where is it? The amygdala. This little bit here is the source of our trouble. Now, one weird thing with teenagers is during puberty, your amygdala is overfiring. Kind of like what happens when your dog barks when you're recording a lecture. So we break risk down into these 4 categories of physical, cultural, chemical, and biological. Now, one weird thing. In high school, this part of your brain is overfired. This part of your brain, called the prefrontal cortex, calms things down. When your amygdala gets stimulated by risk, it's actually sometimes thrilling and people enjoy it. It's around the age of 19 to 20 for men, 23 to 25 for men, and around 19 to 20 for women. The amygdala calms down and the prefrontal cortex keeps that in check. One example of this affecting you is this is why men pay a higher car insurance rate for longer, because this part of the brain actually makes them, insurance-wise, the more dangerous driver. So these would be examples of physical hazards right here, or physical risks. It's anything just using the basic laws of physics, which includes, which would actually include radiation. In the case of this picture, the 2 forms of risk this worker is getting exposed to is loud noise that can cause hearing damage. But the other thing is this dust, silica dust from cutting of concrete. That respirator is actually not the one that you should be using for silica dust. Silica dust, when it gets into your lungs, causes asbestosis or silicosis. And that is basically scar tissue forming on the inside of your lungs. Cultural risks basically is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But there are other strange ones. One weird thing is now that everybody is doing earbuds all the time, 2 things are going on. One, we're seeing increased rate of loud noise exposure causing hearing loss. The other thing is people are doing this while exercising and not realizing there's cars approaching them from behind, causing more accidents. CrossFitting is very healthy, but wherever CrossFitting takes off, connective tissue injuries follow later. Cell phones are causing distracted driving and distracted walking, including such amazing things as humans walking into utility poles and open manhole covers. This right here is what wearing high heels will do over a long period of time to your feet. Chemical hazards are determined by toxicology. And we've got great examples. We've got heavy metals like arsenic, and we also have DDT. DDT, as we talked about earlier, is a great way to reduce your risk of malaria in areas at high risk for malaria. It comes with major environmental problems. This, by the way, is a creepy DDT is great for you sign from France. The way we figure out chemical risk is doing toxicology studies. In your AP class, you probably got to do an LD50 lab. When we do toxicology, we're looking at what does it dissolve in. Things that dissolve in fats, which are nonpolar, are far more dangerous. What is its persistence, meaning how long does it last in the environment? Does it bioaccumulate, meaning once it gets into your tissue, does it stay there forever? Biomagnification means does it work its way up the food chain, putting things that are at the top of the food chain in greater danger? Does it interact with other chemicals? And is there toxicity? Toxicity is a really creepy measure to figure out how much it will take to kill half of a population. And they call that lethal dose of 50 or lethal dose in 50% of the population. And that's based on polygenic traits having this normal distribution. And they try to figure out what is the LD50. Now, they don't do that with a group of humans. They usually do it with animals like mice. And yes, you get into ethical dilemmas about should we test on animals or not. I'm going to show you some examples on what happens when we don't test on animals. That being said, there is unnecessary animal testing, like cases in the 80s when they were spraying oven cleaner into the face of animals, or trying to figure out how many sticks of lipstick it would take to be toxic in rabbits. But for pharmaceuticals and other things, if we don't test things, we often don't realize how dangerous they are until it's too late. When you do an LD50, you get this dose response curve. And first of all, you can see a few things. This red line, if you notice, it takes up to this point for any of the population to start dying compared to whatever this blue line is. That means this thing has a threshold toxicity, meaning the threshold meaning there's a safe amount you need before it starts impacting the population. This one right here has non-threshold, meaning at even a small dose, parts of the population start dying. Right here, if you find the 50% mark in response, if you find the 50% mark and go straight down, that will give you the LD50. Now, if these were two chemicals on the AP exam, they might ask you which one is more dangerous. The more dangerous one is going to be toxic at lower levels, which in this case is right there. Another way you can see these two on the AP exam is, hang on, is you can see acute and chronic exposure. Sometimes they will take that diagram and they'll say which one is the result of a one-time exposure and which one is the result of chronic exposure. This is where it gets tricky. If it's chronic, it's always going to be more dangerous. So if these were the same chemical, you could assume the blue line is chronic, meaning it's over a longer term. Acute would be a single exposure. Going with that, chronic toxicity is quite a bit harder to measure because it takes more time and more money and more effort to figure out if something is chronic, has chronic toxicity. So acute toxicity tests develop a dose response curve. By the way, over here, this is actually an ad for, let's see if you can remember what this is. Here we are. Arsenic complexion wafers, really popular in the past century, or over a century ago. They decided fair skin meant you weren't working outside and that you had royalty. So to make your skin paler, people would eat tablets of arsenic. It caused other problems like your skin to deteriorate and get open wounds, as well as your hair to fall out. Right here is just the description of threshold, non-threshold. Non-threshold, the key is it's too dangerous at any level. Threshold dose response models means a amount must be reached before subjects start dying. Kind of creepy, but it means it's not too bad in small amounts. So poisons are anything with an LD50 of 50 milligrams or less per kilogram of organism. So yes, what they do is they figure out the mass of an organism in kilograms and then doing unit conversion. Anything that has 50 milligrams or less per kilogram, if it kills you, it's a poison, which, by the way, includes non-toxic crayons for kids. So, but that would involve eating several cartons of crayons. Chronic exposure is frequent long-term exposure in small doses. This is the greatest concern with things that are fat soluble. It's why solubility is an issue. Bioaccumulate means once it's in your body, it's in there for extended periods of time. Bioamplification or biomagnification means it gets concentrated up the food chain. Great example of this from current events is the Flint, Michigan water crisis. Was the result of the city trying to save money because of funding issues, and they got their water from the river rather than their traditional source. The issue was there wasn't lead in the river they didn't realize they had to harden their water before they put it in city pipes because a lot of older city pipes contain trace amounts of lead. Because they didn't harden the water corroded the city pipes and released all of the lead from the city's pipes to the community of Flint. The results of that is they have, in fact, replaced all of the city water lines to help the residents of Flint. The challenge is they haven't replaced from the curb to the house and inside the house. And that costs for homeowners anywhere from a few thousand to tens of thousands of dollars. Bioaccumulation is just things getting concentrated within an organism and during its life as it grows. Biomagnification is things getting more concentrated as you go up the food chain. For example, polar bears have a high level of dioxin, even though they have been nowhere near anything that produces dioxin. Another example of biomagnification is this is why there's a limit to how much, if you live near freshwater sources, how many larger pike that you should eat, things like northern and muskie. And saltwater, this is why they encourage a limited consumption of fish that are higher up on the food chain, like tuna and swordfish and sharks and barracuda. Hazardous chemicals are anything that can cause harm by being flammable, causing damage to your skin, interfering with respiration, inducing allergic reactions to the immune system. There are some amazing things that are more hazardous than people realize. In your classroom are lots of people that have asthma. Things like aerosols, including Axe body spray, that was designed to repel women with good taste, as well as men interested in men with good taste. These things can actually cause problems for people with asthma, causing increased inflammation of their respiratory system. Mutagens are things that cause random mutations of genes. When they cause mutations in body cells, it can cause death or cancer or necrosis, death of that tissue. Well, that's cell death. If it causes mutations in the gametes, it can cause inheritable birth defects. And sadly, mutagens are not going to turn you into Spider-Man or any other part of the Marvel universe. Examples of mutagens include, right here is a shoe x-ray machine. In order to help people figure out if their shoes fit well or not in the 1930s, the shoe stores started carrying these. And you put your foot in there, and as long as you saw your bones weren't crunched, you knew the shoes fit. There are other ways to see if your shoes fit called comfort. This was not dangerous when you were buying the shoes. This was dangerous for the people working in the shoe store because they usually didn't shut it off. And the reason why there's 3 view spots are parent, kid, shoe salesperson. The weird thing is when these things were recalled or taken off the market, no one came and picked them up. My great-grandfather picked up one of these and started playing with x-rays. This was a picture my brother found going through things. If you notice, the reason why the bones are pointed is because he didn't lose his fingertips. He had bone demineralization from x-ray exposure. In his household, a lot of his children, who would be my grandparents and great aunts and uncles, passed away from radiation exposure complications. Teratogens are chemicals, radiation, or anything that can cause birth defects during pregnancy. If you remember the news from the past years, this would include the virus Zika. PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls that are found in some plastics. Thalidomide, I'll show you in the next one. Steroid hormones. Most things are not being properly tested as being teratogens because who wants to say that they were experimenting on pregnant women? Here's what happens when we don't test on animals, especially working in this case with thalidomide. This is an ad from the 1960s. Yes, look at that and be horrified. In case you didn't know, when a woman is pregnant, there is a large parasite in their body jumping on their bladder. Hormone surges are going crazy. Some things are making them nauseous. Their ankles are swollen. And yes, they might be in a little bit of discomfort. And one might even say they probably are justified in being cranky and moody. Rather than suggesting the other half of that pregnancy, learn how to cook or help around the house, in the 1960s, they decided, in 50s, we're going to medicate them with thalidomide. And it'll deal with them and make them a happy housewife again. This is what thalidomide did. It caused, in some cases, it was a teratogen that impeded limb formation in children. And afterwards, they realized they only just tested the drug on men. They did not test the drug on pregnant women. Chemicals can harm the body in other ways as well. Things that attack the nervous system include neurotoxins, the most common ones being heavy metals, but also all these other ones. Industrial solvents can cause other problems to the nervous system. TCE, just so you know, is one of the major chemicals that is contaminating groundwater systems around the country. If you saw the movie Civil Action, that was based on TCE, which stands for trichloroethylene. It's basically it's a metal polishing chemical. Heavy metals, including arsenic, mercury, lead, cobalt, cadmium. Endocrine mimics, which are generally things that mimic estrogen. All human bodies contain estrogen, and we'll talk in more detail about that. And those are often called chlorinated hydrocarbons. One example of that is DDT, which makes DDT a neurotoxin as well as an estrogen mimic. Heavy metals absorb through your skin. They quickly cross the blood-brain barrier, and they cause all of these problems over here. If you saw Erin Brockovich, that was based on hexavalent chromium, and you can see right here all of the issues with chromium exposure. The major source of lead poisoning right over here is actually in lead from gasoline. Another place where we see lead is in house paint, especially in older homes. Arsenic is often used as rat poison. Mercury used to be used in thermometers. The major source of mercury these days is actually from burning coal. One issue with estrogen in the environment, the estrogen mimics, is in women it causes increased cancer rates, earlier onset of puberty, as well as heart disease. In men, it increases rates of gynecomastia, which you might know of as man boobs. Delays onset of puberty, increased fat deposition in men, decreased sperm count, as well as increased rates of breast cancer and heart disease in men as well. If you look around a freshman class, you will see that puberty definitely hits women a lot earlier than it hits men. That was not the case 100 years ago. Because right here, if you look, yes, there was a creepy study in France actually looking at the age of menstruation in women. When you look about 1840, women and men were entering puberty around the same age. These days, it's significantly sooner. Meanwhile, puberty for men has been delayed. This is also why men's car insurance rates take forever to go down. By the way, this is impacting men too. There are sperm counts in men. And let's focus a little bit on DDT. DDT is not all bad. It's just mostly bad. DDT, I can't emphasize this enough, is one of the best ways we have of controlling malaria, which is still the deadliest disease on the planet. The problem with DDT is when we first used it, we thought it was safe because after it was applied, they thought, this is great. We can't find it in the water. We can't find it in the air. We can't find it in the soil. They didn't check the living organisms. Here's how DDT was used to treat head lice and mosquito outbreaks and polio risk in the 1940s. DDT trucks would pull up to the beach. If a school found head lice, they would have DDT playground time, and all the kids would play in a DDT cloud. Ultimately, DDT was banned with the help of Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring. By the time it was banned, it was found in such high concentration in bald eagles, when they sat on the eggshells, the eagles would actually crush their own eggs. We banned DDT, and it took until the 1980s, almost 15 years later, for the bald eagle population to start recovering. Briefly, in the early 80s, we actually they almost changed our national bird to the wild turkey because we had almost killed off our national bird with use of DDT. Now, one of the reasons why chemicals can often cause a lot of risk is we tend to have innocent until proven guilty with chemicals. We don't have enough funds and resources and everything to test everything. The other thing we're not good at testing is synergistic effects are nearly impossible to test if you imagine the combinations of everything. One example of synergistic effects that people have to be cautious about is when you combine Tylenol with alcohol, both of them are liver toxins. When you combine them, they're significantly more toxic to your liver, and it can lead to liver failure. Last lesson in the previous week, we already talked about biological risk. In the case of non-transmissible, those are diseases caused by genes and they call lifestyle. It's not contagious. Transmissible diseases are the ones we're more concerned about, which we spent a lot of time talking about last week. Because a transmissible disease means if we don't take care of it somewhere else, it can come around the world. Transmissible diseases can increase without vaccinations as well as after loss of infrastructure, including natural disasters, war, and loss of healthcare. Lack of treatment can actually make things more contagious. Lack of clean water can make things more contagious. And as we're seeing in current events right now, lack of sufficient testing can also make things more contagious. Another thing is there's things that can just weaken the immune system on their own, including radiation, arsenic, pesticides, HIV, and poor nutrition. These can all lead to increased attacks by allergens and pathogens. So if there's no questions, this is kind of the major overview of risk. So thank you for listening.